Founders Forum, Episode 1.
Open your mind to a new episode of the Founders Forum, the podcast championing a free economy, sound assets, and blockchain solutions. Each week, your hosts, entrepreneur Cole Snell and economist Bob Murphy, interview pioneers and free thinkers to help you develop into the architect of your future.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Our guest today is Michael Kong, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Director of Fantom. He has a background in finance and information technology from the University of Sydney, where he published papers on smart contract security. He worked as the first full-time engineer for Block 8, a blockchain development company in Sydney, and later founded one of Australia's first funds in digital assets, now Trovio Group. Without further ado, here is our conversation with Michael Kong.
Michael, Bob, and I'd like to welcome you to the show. Bob, what's on your mind?
Thanks, Cole. Michael, so thanks for joining us on this inaugural episode of the podcast. We're excited, and I think Cole and I both thought in terms we were brainstorming about who should the first guest be. You were a natural choice. Can you just tell the listeners, I mean, they've heard a little bit about your formal credentials and background, but maybe just tell briefly the events you want to highlight as to how did you end up where you are right now and what's your connection with Austrian economics and I guess political libertarianism?
Yeah, sure. That's quite like a long question. I can give like a long explanation for it. Like
in 800 words or less. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, thank you very much, guys, for having me on the podcast for your very first episode. It's amazing to be with you guys, and in particular, Bob, who I've been following for quite a few years now, actually, just lurking in the background, listening to the podcast and not really saying anything myself. But how my journey kind of began, if I can talk more about libertarian Austrian economics, is that it really began, I think, in my mind in 2007, late 2007. And for some reason, as someone who was just becoming a teenager, I just one day decided to watch these presidential debates, right? And then I, listened to what all these people were saying on the stage, and they're all kind of saying similar stuff. But then one individual in particular stood out, and that is Dr. Ron Paul. Some people might know quite well. He's retired now, but at the time he was running for president for the 2008 election. And he had a number of moments where he was just talking very differently from the rest of the candidates in many ways. In particular, I remember on foreign policy, and there's a famous moment called the Giuliani moment, where now, in 2022, after what has happened in Afghanistan, is very, predictive. And so that kind of led me into looking at libertarianism and the ideas that back Ron Paul's ideas, because he was telling people on interviews and stuff, oh, if you want to learn more, go to Mises.org. And me being this little child, impressionable child, was just oh, okay, Dr. Paul, well, what is Mises.org, right? And then I just read about this stuff on the internet. And over time, I understood more and more as I was growing up, what these ideas were related to economics, and this idea about Austrian economics, which obviously you're not taught in school. You're taught very much the mainstream neoclassical / Keynesian economics. So that's really how my journey to libertarianism began. And then I met more like-minded people in Sydney, where I'm originally from. And I found out that a few people, but not many, but a few other people held similar beliefs and had kind of a similar story to me. And how that kind of led into crypto was in 2012, I'd heard about Bitcoin because I was listening to a podcaster called Peter Schiff. And, he's kind of a bit notorious in the space because he's very, because he shares, I think, a lot of similar philosophical beliefs when it comes to libertarianism economics. But fundamentally, he is against Bitcoin. And he was telling people, oh, stay away from this. It doesn't really work. He called it fool's gold, etc. And so I kind of believed him as someone who followed him quite a lot back then. But then in say 2013, I talked to more people. You end up really convincing me that, Bitcoin actually it's basically anti-central banking. It is really free market money. People can decide if they want to use it or not. So it's voluntarism. It's not run by any central authority. And therefore, it is in that sense, real money by that definition. And so that's when I got more interested in it. But I wasn't so much interested in working on the technology, to be honest, because I saw it more as payments and storage, which is not something that I was technically very much interested in. But then about 2015 or 2016, there were a couple of people on campus at the University of Sydney where I studied, and they were talking about this new technology called Ethereum and smart contracts. And I was saying, hey, it's a similar technology to Bitcoin, but you can deploy all sorts of different applications on the network that what we now call like DeFi or decentralized finance, and doing all this peer-to-peer kind of like transfer of value and communication. And that's when I got a lot more interested technically in the space. And so I did some like academic research in the area. I ended up working for a couple of companies. And then that's how I really got started. And the Fantom journey, there's a long story there. But initially I was working at a fund and we were involved in signing up this new project called Fantom, where the person who worked with in Korea said that he had these ideas around new technology, etc. And we kind of like started this company up together. But then we found out that the technology he was talking about wasn't exactly real. And so I ended up stepping in a lot more, same with other people. And then we ended up developing the technology that we have today, which is very different from how it started out. There were a lot of internal issues, but now it's definitely like a lot better than it was back then.
It's amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Do you have a favorite Austrian? Mises, Hayek, Menker, Rothbard, Murphy, possibly?
Well, apart from Dr. Murphy here on the call, in terms of favorite Austrians, I would say, even though I'm not sure if he's technically an economist, but like Mario Rothbard, right? Like Mario Rothbard is the one that fundamentally explained many of the ideas that really underpin like anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism. Yeah, we're basically from first principles, talking about how there's only one real right, it's property rights. But logically, you can derive what they call like praxeology. You can use praxeology, or you can use logic to derive that therefore you can't use force and stuff, and you got to follow the non-aggression principle. So I like Rothbard the most because he just is the one that lays down the fundamentals, I think, for the entire philosophy that we kind of like believe in.
And just to clarify for the listener, that Rothbard is a definite card-carrying economist. He has a PhD from Columbia. He taught at UNLV. So he wrote on lots of stuff. So
just my ignorance and like,
No, it's okay. You're just covering your bases. I know, but I didn't want people to say, Bob doesn't even know Rothbard's an economist. He just sat there. So I had to speak up. So
yeah, sorry about that, guys. Yeah.
So can you speak just a little bit more again, because we're going to have a lot of different people in the audience and some are going to know Fantom really well. But like nowadays, real quickly, you're at dinner with somebody and you say, oh yeah, I'm the CEO of Fantom. And they say, well, what is that? Like, what is Fantom? Just in case some of the listeners don't know what it is.
So Fantom is one of these, it's its own like distributed ledger network. And what I mean by that is it's similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum in the sense that you have nodes that validate transactions on the network, and there are a bunch of rules that these nodes follow, right? So fundamentally, Fantom is its own blockchain platform. And on top of that blockchain platform, you can build all sorts of different applications on top of it. So what people have probably like heard like in the media and elsewhere about like DeFi, or what's known as decentralized finance, or NFTs, or being able to send money peer-to-peer. These are all the kind of applications you can build on top of this technology. And it's really kind of like the internet in the sense that people can connect to one another directly. People can set up their own nodes to earn an income by validating transactions on the network. Anybody can join and leave, can deploy their own application. You can choose which applications to interact with, just like you can choose what websites you want to visit and who you want to interact with on the internet. It's pretty much the same sort of concept, except with a blockchain, what you have is a lot of like transfer of economic value, and it's represented in the form of like what are tokens, and tokens can represent like real world assets. They can just represent like virtual money, and people will do transactions in this virtual money, which can have like actual real world value. And that's the key difference between like this sort of network, distributed network, versus say the internet, which is also a distributed network, which you can do payments through, but you have to do it through like a third party, right? So you can't control your own money or your own economic value.
You don't have to read too far to understand how difficult it is to be successful as a founder, or as an entrepreneur, or even running a business. I mean, I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but a high percentages of startups fail. We all know that. That's kind of widely understood. Do you feel as though the founder today, the founder in 2023, the startup in 2023, the CEO who's operating a company that's 10, 20, 30 years old, do you think the decision makers in these corporations today have a responsibility to either understand, well, maybe they're not going to have to understand Austrian economics or understand the cornerstones to it, but do you think they maybe have a responsibility to understand blockchain technology, and what would be the pitfalls for operators in business today to maybe not understand it or maybe plead ignorance?
I think like the first thing for the audience to understand is that I think there's a lot of like hype around blockchain technology in the sense that some people might think, oh, blockchain technology can solve all your problems, right? Like no matter what business it is, no matter what problem you're trying to solve, blockchain can somehow be at least like part of the solution. And just to emphasize, I think blockchains have like specific use cases that like can add tremendous value. So for example, if you're like performing decentralized finance transactions, or you want to do like transactions related to, for example, like lending and borrowing, right? You can do that on the peer-to-peer network using blockchain technology. And that has a lot of benefits versus like a centralized system. For example, you control your funds. There's more transparency in the code that's operating there. You don't really have to trust a third party. You minimize fees because you're not paying the brokerage fee, because the network fee that you pay to confirm your transaction, it all happens autonomously, which means that the cost is like far lower than you using like a manual broker. Plus, like with a system, say like with Fantom or like other networks, the time it takes to confirm a transaction can literally be like 1 second, right? As opposed to the traditional finance network, which depending on what kind of transaction you can send, it could even take days. And sometimes it doesn't even go through in the end. And you got to solve that problem. So, that's, for example, like one use case. Other use cases around like digitizing unique goods. So NFTs, whether they're like unique digital items or they're unique digital representations of physical items. That's like a great value there. The supply chain management is another great value, or creating a system where people will create self-insurance pools where instead of like a third party that's issuing the insurance that people interact with, you have like a pool of individuals that come together and contribute money to an insurance pool and then use the insurance funds to pay out claims, and people are held accountable to one another in this sort of system. And that's all made possible by blockchain technology. So I think for like a business person out there, I think they need to understand what blockchain technology is and try and figure out, okay, does this technology actually help to solve problems that I'm trying to solve? Or does it actually help enhance my business in what my business is trying to do? And in many cases, the answer would be no. But in some cases, the answer might be yes. And if the answer is yes, then it's worthwhile exploring exactly how that's possible, how to do it practically. Or if the answer is no, then you don't really have to go that far. But you've always got to keep like knowing what's happening in general in terms of like technology and progress, right? You've always got to be aware of like what is happening in different technological fields, even if they're not directly related to what you're doing. Because you never know if someone might develop a technology that actually might be useful for your business line in the end.
Just to piggyback on Cole's question there, I remember, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but like in the mid 90s, let's say, when the internet was just taking off and like more and more companies in their radio ads would say, well, for more information, go to www, and they'd give their website. And I used to make fun of that, like thinking like my local grocery store has a website. Okay, like I need to go on the computer to figure out where the eggs are. Like, and it just, to me, the idea that like I knew certain niche applications might use this new thing called the internet or the World Wide Web. But the idea that every store would have to have a website like in 10 years, like that didn't even occur to me. So I'm wondering if it'd be a similar thing here. Like, yes, you're coming up with obvious use cases, but if this is like a new technology, it's like saying, oh, who's gonna need to use email? Maybe the professional executive might need it, but the regular people will still write it by hand. Like, obviously that's not the case. Like everybody uses the internet and so forth.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Bob. Like some of the use cases I illustrated is just like what I've been able to think like logically with the existing technology, what might be possible. But obviously we're not central planners. We can't predict the future, 5-10 year plans, 1,000-year plans or anything like that. So maybe there are use cases out there that people haven't really discovered yet.
Yeah, like one I've heard of, and I'm curious if your reaction, you guys, was like title registration or deeds to property. Like that's a great thing where, especially in some region where the government doesn't do a good job providing secure rights to like this piece of real estate. And yeah, they can send in troops of the police and just take, your house and say it's theirs. But like the community would know that, no, that's actually the rightful owner of that is such and such. If you could get to an equilibrium where we all look to in terms of where is the actual information stored publicly as to who owns this piece of land is on this blockchain over here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in the end, like the general use case of blockchain technology is that it's like a publicly available audit trail, right? So you can see like which wallet owns what and the transactions that go in and out of that wallet, And obviously there's a problem there in terms of like, if you want to keep transactions private or, there's information you want to keep private, that is like one of the downsides of a public blockchain. But a public blockchain being public also has a lot of benefits. And that's to do with transparency, as you mentioned, Bob. And so if people need to validate certain data, if they need what is commonly called a single source of truth in the space, then the blockchain is a great use case for it.
Having had a career as a founder of almost 30 years, I recently, in the last 5 years, before I started my existing project, went around to so many different blockchain experts and pitched them on use cases and that would bolster business ideas that I had around use. I knew I wanted to implement blockchain technology into my business somehow. It was like blockchain was leading the charge and I was trying to backfill it with an actual business that would fit blockchain. And the number of times that experts like you, Michael, would say to me, yeah, Cole, that's a really interesting idea, but you really don't need blockchain for that. I heard that so many times, and I really respected these people for being honest with me because I know they could have just sold me on, yeah, sure, we'll use blockchain for that. And all they had on the back end was like a spreadsheet. So do you see that happening? Is this a systemic thing? Do you see a lot of, say, companies out there or marketing companies selling blockchain use case or kind of applications of blockchain when there's really either not a need for it or maybe there's actually really no actual blockchain behind the thing that they're trying to do or sell?
I do think there are some companies out there that are just looking to get business done, right? So they say like, oh, you need a blockchain, or let me just like build it for you, or oh, your business does like X, Y, Z, and without like really thinking about like whether it adds value or not, they say, well, you requested a blockchain, so I'll go in there and build your blockchain system, and good luck to you, right? So I think that there is that sort of like mentality to a certain extent, but I think also on the flip side, there are like criminal businesses out there that like are looking at blockchain technology. And I think they really are thinking it from the point of view of like, there's this new emerging technology. There's obviously been a lot of talk about it. There's been some controversy, but it also looks like the technology is real. First of all, is the technology real? And if it is, can I apply it to what I'm doing right now? Or even like, okay, if the technology is real, the use cases, are they like a potential threat to my business? And is there like some way that I can somehow like turn that threat into like an advantage for myself or neutralize it in some way, so to speak, right? Whether that's like through the government or not. So I think businesses like are very much like skeptical about like whether blockchain technology is like useful for them or not. And I think that's the right attitude to have, is that, just in general, be skeptical, be very critical. It's not just like blockchain technology where there's been a lot of hype about. It's like, you heard a lot of hype about like virtual reality, right? Or like AI, right? And I've seen pictures where people say like, oh, AI will solve all your problems, etc. And like, okay, maybe it will in the future, but with the current technology, that's already possible. But there are specific use cases where AI can be very, very useful for you, right? And so it just, as I mentioned before, it's just figuring out, okay, do you recognize it's useful to you right now or not? And just to always just be learning about like what is new, what is happening, and just keep your eyes open all the time.
Can I ask, I think this is maybe the proper point to ask this one, Michael, just sort of piggybacking on Cole, bringing up the skepticism and this, distinguishing the hype from the reality. So you earlier mentioned Peter Schiff and how ironically what got you into this stuff was his own skepticism. I mean, for people who don't know, Schiff just bashes Bitcoin all the time, saying, it's fiat, it's not backed up by anything, its intrinsic value is zero, and that's where it's going to go in the long run, blah, blah, blah. And, Schiff is a big gold fan. So I have my own reactions to him and whatever, but that's not the point for right now. So my question, though, is, Michael, given your familiarity with, the Austrian literature and such, can you speak to, because I'm sure we do have maybe some older folks in the listening audience who, what is this newfangled? I know what a piece, a hunk of metal, that's gold, and I know what that is, this stuff. And, with FTX and all this, didn't 2022 prove that this stuff is really just a big, all smoke and mirrors? And, I don't know if I want to get into all that. So I think there are people that are, have that attitude, and I'm wondering, do you understand where they're coming from? And then, what are they missing if you think they are missing something?
Yeah, I definitely understand what you're asking. And I think the best way to think about this is like, fundamentally, what are the properties of money, right? And how do you apply the properties of money to different things that claim to be money, right? Well, usually there's like, I think like a number of characteristics about money. Like it's got to be like fungible. It's got to be like transferable from one party to another. It's got to hold its value. And it's got to be something that like people like recognize as like a medium of exchange, right? And I think there's like 3 or 4 like essential characteristics. And like, why do we like often say, from our point of view, why like fiat currency is not really money, right? Why it's just like currency, right? It's because like, yes, it's divisible. Yes, it has a medium of exchange, but is it really something that has actual like intrinsic value, right? Or is it something that can be just inflated to infinity, which means that, if you have like $1 out of infinity, well, that still like goes to zero, right? Or if it's like $1 billion over infinity, it's still zero, right? So we say that, yes, fiat currency has many of the characteristics of money, but it's missing a crucial one, and that is like having its own intrinsic value. So, the reason why like people say that gold is money, I do believe that gold is a form of money, is because it is fungible, it is a medium of exchange, and it does have its value because there's only so much gold that's out there, right? You can't magically print gold to infinity. But then people like Peter Schiff, I think what they misunderstand is they think, well, you see, Bitcoin is purely software. And what is software? It's code. And I can just like copy and paste code all day long. And so I can just create infinite amount of digital currencies that I want. And the Bitcoin supply, yes, it's capped technically at 21 million at the moment, but there's nothing stopping it from going to infinity, right? And technically that is true. However, what do people like view Bitcoin as, right? Well, they view Bitcoin as this currency that people have come to consensus will stay at 21 million Bitcoin, right? And if that number changes, it's all done like voluntarily. And if people want to use the currency or not, or if people want to use Bitcoin or not, that's sort of like their decision to make, right? So it's all like completely like voluntary, like form of money that anybody can use. But it does have intrinsic value in that all the transactions on the Bitcoin network are secured by a lot of computation. And that's what makes it hard for the Bitcoin network to be hacked. Because if it didn't have security in it, right, then it is true that anybody could go in there and, do what's called like a double spend, right? Which is you spend the same money twice. Well, why can't you do that with gold? Because you can't just magically duplicate the gold in your hand after you've given, the ounce of gold to someone, right? Well, it's actually the same with Bitcoin. You can't just duplicate a Bitcoin and then give someone like the original Bitcoin, right? Why is that? Because the duplicated Bitcoin will not be recognized by other people in the network as actually being legitimate Bitcoin, right? Because there's a lot of like mathematics and all of this computation that goes into the network, what we call the miners, right? Where they solve these like mathematical problems to secure the transactions that are on the network, right? So in order for you to kind of forward the network into double spending or adding additional Bitcoin into the network, you have to somehow like trick a majority of participants who are using the network. And that is something that is like very, very expensive to do. So there are like inbuilt security properties for Bitcoin while still allowing it to be like a publicly available network that anybody can access. So each Bitcoin is secured by like a lot of like a computation that's out there. So it's very, very hard to duplicate. Like technically, yes, it's possible if you have infinite like resources to be able to do it. But if you have infinite resources, technically you could also duplicate gold because people have actually been able to like make gold, except like the amount of cost to actually make gold scientifically is a lot more than your inputs, right? Well, it's the same thing with Bitcoin. The amount of money it costs for you to make a new Bitcoin by yourself and try and forward the network, it costs a lot more than the actual value of the Bitcoin itself, if that makes sense. So in that sense, there's a lot of security to prevent duplication, just like in preventing gold duplication as well.
Yeah, synthetic gold, it reminds me a lot of... Yeah, no, that was a really good answer. When you're talking about synthetic gold, I'm really starting to think about synthetic diamonds and what that is doing to the actual real diamond industry. It's pretty fascinating. And talk about disruption. As you were answering Bob's question, you used a word quite a few times that really is an emotional word in the industry. And the word was security. Really makes me think a lot about the news of 2022 and as it relates to a lot of businesses. As we see this, euphoria in crypto, let's call it, blockchain space kind of turn to whatever emotion you want to call it by the end of 22. And we see projects like Terra Luna and 3 Arrows and Celsius, Voyager, FTX go down the list. Is the security token marketplace, and is it a solution to a lot of the problems that a lot of these companies and a lot of the, say, the correction in 2022 in the space, thinking about if you're a business owner today and you want to diversify your balance sheet. And I mean, I think it's widely understood that Bitcoin makes a lot of sense as to why Bitcoin is not a security. We can talk about things like Howey, for example, how we test passive income laws and things like that. If you're a business owner today, having a balance sheet with some type of token on it, would it make more sense to have a security token or a traditional DeFi token, or would it be like a blend of the two? And then do you think the security token marketplace is something to be looking out for in 2023?
I think it really depends on like what you're looking to do, right? So security tokens have a lot of value if you want to deal in securities, right? And you might say, okay, well,
Hey, Michael, can I ask you real fast just to make sure we're not losing a chunk of the audience? Can you just explain, like, to a third grader, what is the difference between a crypto coin and a security token?
Yeah, sure. So in law, there's a concept of what's called like a security, right? And security is basically like a financial product or some sort of like contract or representation, usually of what's known as like equity or debt, right? And essentially what a security token is a tokenized representation of that sort of like contract, right? So to give you a simple example, you might create a company that has 100 shares, right? And you can own like a share of the company. And if you own a share of the company, it represents 1% of the company, right? Because 100 shares outstanding. You could create a security token off of that, in that you mint a token that has a supply of 100, and each token you say represents 1-to-1 with actual ownership of the company, right? And so in a sense, like if you own one token, you own one share. And if you own one share, you own 1% of the company. And so that is what a security token is. And it's the same thing with like the same sort of concept, say like if you were like to issue a bond, you can have it represented in the form of a token that makes it tradable. And so the benefit of like why you might want to consider tokenization or having the security representation on a blockchain is all like the kind of benefits of a blockchain that you get kind of in general. Like, for example, you have like tradability between people in the network because, people can interact directly without going through like a third party or broker to acquire and sell the security. We have the benefits of like an audit trail in that, you can see the entire history of like who owned, what securities and how it's been changed over time. And you can interact with what are known as smart contracts, which are computer programs that run on a blockchain network that allow you to perform all sorts of transactions, right? And if you use a smart contract and the code is out there and open source, you can verify mathematically exactly how, the smart contract interacts. So it's not like you're giving your money to a third party and you have to trust that everything is kosher. You can actually, that everything's kosher when you're doing the blockchain because it's fully transparent and you can see the code and the actual transactions that go on around the security. So that is like what a security token is and why you might want to consider using or issuing one on the blockchain. And this is quite different from, say, non-security tokens that are out there, because non-security tokens may represent things in the real world or purely digital that are not typically classified as securities in the sense of like, say, equity or debt.
Okay. And then in Bitcoin isn't a token at all in this nomenclature, right?
Well,
and so that's a separate category?
Yeah, in popular like parlance, right? Like technically like Bitcoin is like a crypto token, right? In the sense that, yes, it does like run on the blockchain and you can divide it, which is like the base definition of a token. But usually when people talk about like crypto tokens, they don't often refer to like Bitcoin. They refer to like all sorts of other tokens out there except Bitcoin. For example, like the second most popular like token out there is called Ether or Ethereum. And there are many others. And all these tokens have like all sorts of different use cases depending on the sort of like applications that they're really used for in the end.
Okay, so back to Cole's question. I just want to make sure. So when Cole's saying should people consider security tokens, that's what he's getting at, like these things that represent a financial security, like that are digital representations of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the end, if people want to consider using security tokens, it really depends on like their use cases. If they have something that they know is security and they want to tokenize it because they see the benefits for it, then a security token can be like really appropriate for it. But if you're creating a token that you may think doesn't have the properties of security, obviously like, always talk to a lawyer about this before and seek legal advice, but you might consider like issuing a token that isn't really like a security, right? And there are certain like legal implications or legal requirements that you need to follow if something is technically security or not, which I'm not qualified to really speak about because I'm not a securities lawyer or an accountant in any way. I have no background in that. But it's just like different use cases depending on what you're planning to do. You may consider launching, if you decide to launch a token, whether it's a security or not, you may consider it depending on what you're looking to do, really.
Michael, when you think about the idea of money, and you were mentioning, you were describing a bit of a definition of money, a mechanism of exchange, we're talking about currency. When I bring up the idea of sound money to you, what comes up? And I know Bob has written a number of books around sound money, and you've probably read his books. I know you're a fan. What comes up for you when you think about sound money, the importance of sound money, is sound money to you a definable term? Like when you're with your colleagues and you're out at a dinner party and you say sound money, do people in your circle understand kind of what that means? And then how would you describe it?
I think if you were to speak to like a libertarian audience, I think if you use the term sound money, I think most of them, if not all of them, would probably understand what we meant by that. But like when we talk about sound money, to me, like it really comes down to what are the characteristics of this medium exchange you're talking about, right? Because as I mentioned before, like money has like certain particular characteristics in order for it to be money. First of all, it has to be a medium of exchange, i.e. you're able to like transfer it from like one individual to another as some sort of like commercial exchange, right? And it's fungible or divisible, meaning that like you can divide up the money into like any particular number of units that you want. And one unit is the same as another. For example, like $1 is the same as another $1. One Bitcoin is the same as one Bitcoin, or 1 ounce of gold is exactly the same as like 1 ounce of gold. And the other property as well is that it has to have like some sort of store of value, right? So it's not something that can just like disappear and break down because it's something that's like perishable, right? It can't be something that can be inflated to infinity because it's just like digits on a computer, right? Because then it means that it loses value, which means that people fundamentally shouldn't really be able to like trust it in the end, right? Because at any moment, this thing that you own, that you believe representative value, that you got to exchange for goods and services, suddenly has no value in the end, right? And so to me, like something that has those characteristics is what I would consider to be sound money, and something that people would be able to, engage in commerce with to represent the value of goods and services in the economy. Because in the end, people don't acquire money for the sake of acquiring money, right? They acquire money because you can use it to exchange for goods and services in the economy, right? Because in the end, having like paper bills or having like ounces of gold in your basement doesn't really like enhance your life, right? But you can exchange it for real things, right? For example, like a holiday, for example, like a house, etc. And that has like real utility and real value. And so the problem with what the mainstream media or what they teach in school about money is they say, oh, the US dollars that you have is money, or the Australian dollars that you have is money. And when you think about it, yes, it does have a lot of characteristics of money, but it's missing one important characteristic, and that is it's not a store of value. Why? Because we have the central banks that are out there that control the issuance of money. We say it has a monopoly over the money supply, and they can technically inflate it to infinity. And if someone can inflate the money in your wallet to infinity, then it doesn't have any store of value. And therefore, you can't really consider it to be sound money. You can say it has the other characteristics that I mentioned, but you can't say that it's a store of value.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, and actually, Cole, it is that phrase "sound money" isn't some of my work, but it was Carlos Lara, who I know you know, that got me really to embrace that. I had read the phrase, but it was Carlos that really drove home to me the importance of that phrase, and I went back with that mindset and reading like Human Action and other things from Mises. And he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but in the old classical liberal, tradition, to them, sound money, it wasn't an economic thing. It wasn't like a matter of financial policy. He said it was important, like the way a Bill of Rights was important, like the principle of free speech, that this was a way to sound money, which for Mises meant the gold standard, back in the day. That was a way to tie the government's hands. So just like you would say the government can't mess with newspapers, like that would be a very dangerous thing to allow the government to have the power to tell newspapers what they could and couldn't print. By the same token, the government shouldn't be able to just print up new currency that's not backed by gold or silver. Like to them, it was the same. Like in other words, it's limiting the power of the government, because if they can just debase the currency, what can't they do to you? That's too powerful. That's too much power to be vested in that. So it was interesting just to read the way he was viewing it. It was a matter of like the rights of man kind of thing. It wasn't just like, oh, if inflation exceeds 13%, that will be suboptimal. That's not the way he was thinking about it.
It's so interesting that we're talking about this right now. So I went to the internet before this conversation and I cross-referenced and Googled a bunch of top 10 assets in the USA. And I looked at lots of different lists and from lots of different, I won't cite them right now, but what I came up with was the aggregate of my 20 minutes of research was real estate 1. I'll go 1 through 10. Stocks, 401ks, RSPs for the Canadians, cash or cash equivalents, bonds, mutual funds, personal vehicles, bank deposits, business ownership, and then life insurance policies was number 10, actually. And so as I I'd love to ask both of you guys, of any of those 10, does anything jump out at you as, I'll do them again really quickly. So research the internet, looked at a bunch of different sites, top 10 kind of assets, real estate. And again, we're talking about currency, leverageable, not leverageable, appreciating, depreciate, real estate, stocks, investments, like retirement accounts, cash equivalents, bonds, mutual funds, personal vehicles, bank deposits, business ownership, and life insurance policies. Michael, anything jump out at you as interesting? Do you think this is what, when you go to the internet and Google most common assets in America, do you think that's what you'd find? Would you expect to find that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's the same with like many other countries out there. Yeah, for example, like talking about Australia, where I'm from, it would be pretty much the similar characteristic, because sort of the mentality there when you're growing up, as I'm sure it is in like the US and Canada and many other Western nations, is like, oh, you got to get a job to earn money so you can get a mortgage, you can buy a house, and then you raise a family in that house. And also like at the same time, you got to think about like where you're going to be when you're like 60 or 70 years old, and so you got to save money for it. And so, retirement planning, would be up there. Real estate would be up there. Everyone knows about like equities or the stock market. So a lot of people put their money in there. So a lot of those characteristics, a lot of those assets that you mentioned there in the top like 9 or 10 I think would be similar across many different countries.
Bob, what about you?
Yeah, I was actually surprised. So the specific thing you looked for was like top assets in 2023.
Common.
Was that
I think top common assets in the USA is what yeah.
Huh. I guess I was pleasantly surprised that life insurance made the list because, obviously our work and, I mentioned Carlos Lara, the stuff I do with him, of course.
Yeah.
I've been big on trying to educate the public that the benefits of using life insurance as an asset, not just as a means of, the death benefit and to provide for your spouse or something. But yeah, I guess I'm pleasantly surprised that because it seems like there's been a lot of negative press, about, oh, you don't need that. That's not a way to store wealth or something. So I'm pleasantly surprised. But precious metals didn't make that list?
No, we had 11 was collectibles, 12 intellectual property, equipment, machinery, timberland, 15 cryptocurrency, natural resources was 17.
Oh, I'm quite surprised that resources and collectibles, would be
precious metals was 18.
Wow, I would have thought that would be so.
Yeah,
I would rather have gold and silver than timberland right now.
Right, but I guess this is kind of why.
Equal.
Right, so I guess this is fundamentally why we're having this conversation. Really, is to educate people on. I mean, the one that stood. I mean, so life insurance for me was I was really pleasantly surprised. I mean, we're kindred over life insurance properly designed as an asset. We know that, and then personal vehicles at number 7, whereas precious metals was number 18. When you're drawing these kind of like, how is a vehicle an asset? I don't really, it seems like a liability, truthfully. if you're going to put it in one column. But hey, who am I? What it comes up for you guys? Does this mean that like we have some work to do? We have some education to do? I mean, is a vehicle an asset? I guess to some degree, it could be. I guess if you're cash flowing it, but
yeah, I mean, I'll go real quick. I mean, if they just mean the typical household and list your asset, and if somebody had their car paid off and they were and even there though, you're right. Like you would normally, my guess would be there's not much equity in somebody's vehicle, like actual vehicle, and so if they're saying we have even less in gold and silver right now, yeah, I think that's not a great portfolio, as it were, for the household given the current environment. But if it's merely reflecting the fact that people are strapped and they haven't been able to accumulate a lot of the precious metals, then that's one thing. But I think it probably does reflect also a lack of education, I would guess. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I would broadly agree with what you said, Bob. When it comes to like life insurance being like number 9 in the US, it was a little surprising as well. But I think when a lot of people think about like life insurance, they think about it more like what we call term-based insurance, right? Because there are a lot of ads that are out there in the US, and similar in Australia and probably other countries as well, where they really talk about like term life insurance, and that you want a life insurance policy because, in case something happens, something bad happens, at least your family will be taken care of and you'll get like a payout and that sort of thing. But I think a lot of people out there don't really understand that there's actually different kinds of like life insurance out there. And the different kinds are, there's not just like term-based insurance. There's also this idea of whole life insurance, which I know that both of you have been talking about a lot. I've been talking about a lot and have been like practically engaging in your own lives and businesses as well. And, the concept of whole life insurance obviously is very different from term insurance. And some people out there, are probably not really aware of like whole life insurance and the potential benefits of whole life insurance, and this whole idea of what, you have called, Bob, and other people, quote unquote, infinite banking, which on the basis of it, sounds a bit too good to be true. What do you mean like infinite banking? Well, like just like keep taking out money infinitely? Well, in reality, it's kind of like being your own bank.
Yeah. I mean, and so I'm glad you made a distinction. Again, we don't know the audience characteristics, and some people know many things. Some people might be tuning in just because, Michael, they know your affiliation with Fantom, and that's what they cared about. And this is completely new to them. But yeah, for people who haven't heard that before, I mean, it's so a term life insurance policy obviously is a good thing to have. It protects your family, but it's not it wouldn't be a component of your wealth. Just like if you have fire insurance on your house, that's a wise thing to have, but it's not that you would say, oh, and my wealth right now, I've got this much in stocks, this much in bonds, and this much in fire insurance on my house. Like that doesn't even make sense. It's just saying it makes you whole in case a disaster happens. So, likewise with the term, but whereas, as you're saying, Michael, with a whole life policy, or there's other types of permanent life, cash value life insurance that, yeah, you actually build equity to paraphrase or to use a common way of describing it. So I would encourage people to look into that if this is news to them. But like you say, Cole, I was pleasantly surprised. At least that made the list, though. Again, the ranking of some of the things you mentioned there seemed odd to me, that the precious metals were so low or
very odd,
so high on the list.
Right. Totally get it. And I even took it one step further, and I went to Google Trends, and I measured from 2004 through this year present, and I searched all of the world. And for those listeners that don't know, I mean, it's just googletrends.com, search that, and you can punch some keywords in and look at SEO, essentially search engine optimization, how many times people have searched this one kind of keyword. And I looked up infinite banking, and then I looked up whole life insurance as a curiosity. And around late 2021, there's about a 250% spike on both whole life insurance, cash value whole life insurance, and infinite banking. They almost mirror each other. And it was just absolutely remarkable to see. And I think that's why it is on the list. Life insurance is on the list. Obviously, I don't think the list didn't define a term or say permanent life insurance, but obviously, if they're considering it an asset, it would be permanent because term wouldn't make the cut. It was pretty remarkable to see how many people. And so, Michael, like just out of curiosity, in your world, so to speak, again, you're out with there's a whole bunch of CEOs of layer 1 blockchains in a room. I mean, how many of them are talking about infinite banking or, say, cash value whole life insurance as an asset or a leverage strategy or, store value in some way?
It's not really that many. So like in the blockchain space, many people like...
I didn't think so.
Yeah. Like as I said, like as a proportion of like the number of people like in the blockchain, or I guess like the cryptocurrency space compared to the rest of the population, in terms of like the proportion of people that are libertarians is definitely like much higher, right? And there are a lot more people compared to the general population that do have like understanding of like, or to some degree, like Austrian economics and libertarianism and kind of like the principles of both. However, there's not really that much discussion on like infinite banking. And I'm not exactly sure why. Because I remember when I first heard the concept of infinite banking, I think I was still a teenager, because naturally, I went to Mises.org, I went to these libertarian sites, and I came across individuals such as Dr. Murphy that we have in the podcast today, as well as others, and they were talking about this concept of infinite banking. And maybe part of the reason why there's not so much like discussion about it is, one, it could simply be because in like many countries of the world, this whole concept of taking out a whole life insurance policy and using it is not actually like really possible. Like in Australia, I don't think such a system is actually possible, or at least to my knowledge. So we never really talked about it that much in Australia, because there wasn't much like practically we could do in terms of it. But I think, there's still a lot of people like in the US, in Canada, obviously. And so I'm not really sure why it's not talked about that much. Like I can kind of speculate and think maybe it's because it's just something that people are not really familiar about. They don't really know much about insurance. They don't really know much about whole life insurance in particular. And to them, maybe it sounds really kind of like very technical, very hard to understand, something that requires like a lot of like in-depth reading and knowledge, where if you just buy a stock, it just sounds like a lot more simple, right? Or if you take out like a mortgage, it just sounds a lot more simple. Plus maybe the fact that a lot of other people are already doing that as well. It's always, people feel kind of like more comfortable to be with the crowd, right? So there's a lot of people, going out and buying stocks or real estate or doing something, whatever it might be, financial or otherwise, maybe you're inclined to go in that direction because you kind of feel safer that you're doing what everyone else is doing. And maybe that's a problem as well. So I think fundamentally, it probably just comes down to like education. Like people just don't really know about it. Like I've gone around and, and I've asked people, oh, have you heard of like infinite banking concept? Or have you heard of whole life insurance? And most of the time it's like, no, what is that? And so I think it really just comes down to education.
Can I ask you, Michael, because you mentioned that the stereotype is correct that in crypto, let's say, or just DeFi, what have you, that there is an overrepresentation of libertarians or even people who are familiar with the principles of Austrian economics. Do you have a theory as to why? Because that's anecdotally my sense too. Like I guess there's a bit of a selection bias that the people that from that sector that are talking to me because I'm an Austrian economist. Obviously, so I get that. But do you know why that might be? Is it kind of like just the obvious that the kind of person that doesn't want the government messing with the money is more likely to be involved in DeFi than someone working for JP Morgan?
Yeah, I think it comes down to kind of like the underlying like characteristics of like blockchain or like cryptocurrency, right? In that, the reason why like I got involved, for example, is because of the idea that you control your assets. It's not other people who control it. You decide who you want to interact with, and you choose like what tokens you want to use and what networks you want to use. And so the characteristics of like that sort of technology really like work well with the underlying philosophy of libertarianism. And I don't have the hard like numbers or data out there, so I am also speaking anecdotally. But I know a lot of people out there who have come into the crypto space because, for example, they see as like Bitcoin as money, right? Or being like a more efficient version of gold is like what some people have also mentioned. And they see the fact that this is a network where like I can choose what I want to do with other people. It's transparent. It's like audible. It's all voluntary. And that's why they like it. And they see it also as an opportunity of like, well, I don't have to like put my money in, the traditional finance system. I don't have to put my money where other people are putting their money. And we've seen sort of the crises that have happened in the past, for example, like with the global financial crisis. So I think it also comes down to like a distrust of the current system that's out there. And people recognize, well, wait a second, with the global financial crisis, there were so many scandals that went on. There's trillions of dollars that just somehow disappeared very, very quickly. Yet no one seemed to really get in trouble as a result of it. Why is that? is it because the government is okay with letting this happen? And if the government is okay with letting this happen, then if I give my money to, centralized institutions, perhaps, I'm giving my power away from the government and I want to have the power myself. So I think if you're an individual, who believes in voluntarism, engaging in this new technology that's emerging, it's quite attractive.
Somehow throughout the course of my life, I've managed to remain an optimist. I haven't actually been in the financial industry for very long, only about 4 or 5 years. You'd think that coming into the financial industry and learning more about it, you would become more pessimistic. But somehow I'm still optimistic. And, it's when I hear the two of you, and I actually, this is a question for both of you, if I could, and maybe Bob, you can go first. Is there a solution here? If I take this plus this, does it equal solution? And does the solution look like control? And so here's kind of the question is, if I take, libertarian ideas plus blockchain, does it look like control? And is that a solution? And do I have a reason to be optimistic, or am I totally nuts?
So yeah, I think there's a good case for optimism on that front. Some people I think oversell it. I mean, because ultimately, the government could just say somebody doing X, Y, and Z will send soldiers to your house and kill you, and that's that's kind of a bummer. And so they can say, but my keys, my coins, and they say, okay, our bullets, your heart, okay. So there's ultimately that issue, right? So it's not like a total panacea, but on the other hand, less glibly, I mean, it is a huge deal. Like some country where the government's totally corrupt or whatever, and the people, if you just want to be able to escape, and if you can just get across the border, well, it's a lot easier for you to transfer your wealth if you can sell it domestically and then just go ahead and get something on blockchain. All you got to do is remember what the key is or whatever. You know what I mean? Remember your passphrase, and that's all you got to do at the checkpoint. Whereas if you're trying to take out even gold, the soldiers can pat you down and you're not going to get over the border. But this way, you just got to have something in your mind and you can do it. So there's that, and then also too, like I was mentioning before, to me the promise of blockchain technology is by putting stuff up there, and it's not even just the public record, but the fact that the community kind of has to sign off on what's a valid transfer or not. To me, that's a critical aspect of it too, like the whole trustless part. That the government can come in and say, no, this house is this person's, but like if the community really knows, no, actually that title did not get transferred the way that we've all agreed at the beginning that the rules were going to be for title transfer with this kind of stuff. So that's just like if the government came in and said, oh, this guy we're sponsoring in this chess tournament, and he's going in and he's castling twice, and see, he won, everybody. Like the community would know, well, he didn't. That wasn't the valid rules of chess. No, he didn't. Like, so the government could say he's the ruler, and we're going to shoot him when he says it, but everybody would know who really won that chess match, right? Because he cheated. So it's that kind of an issue where, and again, it's because ultimately, like David Hume's point, it's that Mises liked, and I think it's a good one too, is like, in a sense, in the long run, governments rest on public opinion. And so that's why they have academia and the newspapers and whatnot and other websites maintain this illusion that, these politicians are your good buddies and they're doing everything for the common interest when we think they're not, because they kind of need the public to believe that. So to me, that's the promise, that you have a type of money that can't be inflated. More people start using it. And we've even seen this. I'll stop here. I know I've been going on a long time and answer your question there, Cole. I'm curious what Michael's response is. That for a while, I think governments were trying, at least the United States, they were just going to try to contain Bitcoin and whatever. And they just decided we can't stop this. So that's why they pivoted. And now they're trying to do central bank issued digital currencies, because they realize we're not stopping this trend. Let's at least just try to get on board and co-opt it. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of bad things happening over the next 20 years. But I think one glimmer of hope is that, the rise of blockchain technology.
I definitely agree with what a lot of Bob has said. In general, like I'm quite a cynical person. I'm definitely very cynical, about the government and about optimism, around the government somehow behaving a lot better than it has in the past, because clearly that doesn't really happen. But on the flip side, I kind of see the benefits of blockchain technology kind of analogous to the internet, right? So with the internet, we have people out there, producing what content they want to produce, right? Including us, right? And having the ability to express a viewpoint, and not just be able to express a viewpoint, but be able to store it basically forever, right? On many people's computers that are out there, and for it to be propagated across all the users of the internet very, very easily with very little friction. Like technically, we put something on the internet there, and the most popular websites out there, they have hundreds of millions, if not billions, of views every single day. And I think it's analogous to the blockchain technology in that I can create an application that's out there that can be used by many, many millions of people that are out there around the world. So long as they have an internet connection, they can connect to it and they can interact with it, right? And people, and to Bob's point about the trustless nature of it, in the end, it's the community participants of these networks that validate the transactions, that confirm, okay, this is the actual transfer that has taken place. This is who actually owns the assets. And I think that's very powerful, because it's like the government, I think a lot of people agree, like can't really shut down the internet, right? If the US government passed a law or an executive for order saying like, we're going to shut down the internet, or, the United States is going to control the entire internet, people would just laugh at them and say, that's not really going to be possible because of the nature of the internet. I think it's similar with blockchain technologies, that if a government comes out and says, all Bitcoin network, the entire Bitcoin network is ours, right? Or the entire Ethereum network is ours. I think people would kind of laugh at that and say, well, it's not really possible, right? And so even though the government would love to 100% control the internet, and even though the government would love to 100% control blockchain technology, it's just not really practically possible, right? And so people have often said, if I put a smart contract out there and I don't have any control over it, and it just like runs autonomously, like what is the government going to do? Like go in there and somehow like try and take over the entire network? It's, technically it is possible, right? Like technically it is possible to take down the internet. It's just very, very difficult to do. And as a result of it, because it's kind of resistant to that sort of coercion, it means that there's the opportunity for people to engage in voluntarism that is hard to kind of like stamp out, or for the government to stamp out itself.
As this is our very first episode, we don't know exactly at this stage who our audience is going to be, but we do know who we're targeting. So if we're doing our jobs, we know we're going to have business owners, founders, CEOs, startup enthusiasts, entrepreneurs chiming in. And, listening to this conversation today, I definitely took away that there's a reason to be optimistic if you can adopt a libertarian attitude and maybe use some blockchain kind of in your business. I think there's a great opportunity, and more than anything, we want to encourage people to get out there and participate in the lifeblood of economy, which is small, medium, and enterprise level businesses. The reason we do it in a lot of ways is so that we can have some control and not have a job and say, work for somebody else. So on behalf of my co-host, Dr. Robert Murphy, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for joining us, the CEO of Fantom. It was an inspired conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are going to take away massive value.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys, for having me. I'm really excited to be on the podcast. It is an honor, and especially to be the very first one as well. So thanks again.
This concludes another episode of the Founders Forum. The information provided is for educational purposes and does not constitute financial advice. Consult with qualified professionals before making any financial or investment decisions. For more information on the hosts and for previous episodes, visit foundersforum.io. Thanks for listening.